Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Beverly White from NBC4. That wasn't meant to be an applause line. I was just finding my place in my script, but thank you. It's my pleasure to be your host this evening for the 16th Annual Thurgood Marshall Lecture and Dinner. I'd like to thank, as we all should, frankly, the UCLA Law School for sponsoring tonight's reception. Let's give them a round of applause. We are gathered here, as you probably know, to honor a gifted individual and this year's honoree, Christoper Edley Jr., the Dean of the UC Berkeley School of Law. Now, thank you. And that is an applause line, so thank you. Now in its 36th year, the Ralph Bunche Center for African American Studies is entering into a new phase of continued excellence and increased scholarly activity. The center fulfills its mission by promoting research and academic programs, maintaining a library, putting on special projects like this one, and publishing current work in African studies. It is one of the leading centers of its kind in America. And leading the center in his fourth year as director is Professor Darnell Hunt. Darnell Hunt is a professor of sociology at UCLA. Dr. Hunt has written extensively on race and the media, including 3 recent books. 1, Screening the Los Angeles Riots, Race, Seeing, and Resistance, and 2, O.J. Simpson, Facts and Fictions, News Rituals in the Construction of Reality, both from Cambridge University Press. He's also the editor of a forthcoming 4-volume series from Oxford University Press on African Americans and the media. The first volume, edited by Dr. Hunt, is titled Channeling Blackness, Studies in Television and Race in America. It came out earlier this year. Prior to his academic career, he worked in the media and as a media researcher for the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights' 1993 hearings on diversity in Hollywood. As Bunche Center Director over the last 3 years, Dr. Hunt has managed research, outreach, and publicity campaigns that are aimed at making the center a household name in the region's Black community, as well as in intellectual circles throughout the nation and beyond. So it is now my pleasure to introduce you to the director of the Ralph Bunche Center for African American Studies, ladies and gentlemen, Professor Darnell Hunt.
Thank you, Beverly, for that warm introduction. Good evening, everyone. I'm pleased on behalf of the Bunche Center faculty and staff to welcome you to the 16th Annual Thurgood Marshall Lecture and Dinner. I'd like to express my gratitude to each of you for your support tonight, and I look forward to connecting with you throughout the evening. For nearly 2 decades, the Bunche Center has embraced this event as an opportunity to honor pioneers in the ever-important arena of human and civil rights. This year's honoree, Dean Christoper Edley Jr., of course, the Dean of Berkeley's Boalt Hall Law School, continues this important tradition. From his public service in the Carter and Clinton administrations to his work as co-director of the Civil Rights Project at Harvard University, to his recent service as a member of the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, race and rights have been at the forefront of Dean Edley's interests and commitments throughout his distinguished career. We are proud to recognize him tonight as the 2005 Thurgood Marshall honoree and lecturer. As most of you know, 2 important friends of the center have passed on since we last gathered for this event. Larry McCormick, a pioneer in Los Angeles television journalism, who graciously emceed this event on 3 prior occasions, and Johnny Cochran, America's most famous trial attorney and our 2003 Thurgood Marshall lecturer and honoree. Both continue to inspire us, of course, through the legacy of their accomplishments. Later this evening, we will pay tribute to Larry and have a special announcement to make regarding a new center project related to his work. And we are particularly pleased to have Anita McCormick here with us this evening to join us for this special tribute. Now I'd like to take a few moments to recognize some special individuals in attendance this evening. First, I'd like to recognize the many prospective and current UCLA students who are present. They are scattered throughout this ballroom. They, of course, are one of the most important reasons why we are here this evening. They represent the next generation of scholars and leaders. Please take time to chat with them this evening. Next, I'd like to acknowledge some other special attendees. First, we have the Bunche Center Community Advisory Board. Could you please stand, members of the Community Advisory Board? The Bunche Center Student Advisory Board. Could you please stand, members? I know they're here somewhere. Okay. And of course, the Bunche Center faculty. I'll warn you, be patient, this is a long list. Former center directors, Belinda Tucker, Richard Yarborough, and of course, our first director, Robert Singleton. Brenda Stevenson, chair of our Afro-Am degree program, which is celebrating its 30th anniversary this year. Mandla Kaise, president, UCLA Black Alumni Association. Winston Doby, UC Vice President for Educational Outreach. Is Tom Sales with us this evening? No? Okay. Well, we thought he might be able to join us, but I guess he couldn't make it this evening. Janina Montero, Vice Chancellor for Student Affairs. Sansia Lilly, Assistant Vice Chancellor for Student Affairs. Renee Dennis, President, Black Faculty and Staff Association. Amy Dorr, Dean, Graduate School of Education, UCLA. Benny Malcolm, General Manager, KTLA. We have Derek Marshall, nephew of Thurgood Marshall. Is Constance Rice with us this evening? Constance Rice was our 1993 Thurgood Marshall honoree. She may be joining us a little bit later on. Peter Taylor, past president of the UCLA Foundation and Bunche Center Community Advisory Board member. John Trasvina, Director, Western Regional Office of the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. Kimberly West Falcon, Executive Director, NAACP Legal Defense Fund, Western Region. And last but not least, Brian Williams, Deputy Mayor, City of Los Angeles. This evening's event, of course, would not have been possible without the generous support of our many sponsors. And they are as follows: Toyota, Nestle, Fox Studios, UCLA School of Law, Winston Doby, UC Office of the President, Peter Taylor, Taylor Family Foundation, Judge Joe Brown, Renee Campbell, Daniel Johnson, Ricky Ivey, Claudia Mitchell-Kernan, UCLA Graduate Division, Jeanette C. Moore, NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund, Rita Rothman, Second Baptist Church, Robert Singleton, Bobby Smith, UCLA Black Alumni Association, UCLA Community Partnerships, UCLA External Affairs, UCLA Faculty Diversity, UCLA Student Affairs, and Glenda Weena. Finally, I'd like to personally thank Beverly White for so graciously agreeing to MC this event for us this evening. Now it's my pleasure to introduce a brief 4-minute video about the Bunche Center. It was produced a few years ago by one of our most promising graduate students in Afro-American Studies. And now it's my pleasure to welcome to the podium the Chancellor of UCLA, Albert Carnesale.
Well, thank you, Darnell. Welcome all. Robin and I are delighted to be here, to be part of this. Let's see. Robin, why don't you stand up? She's not quite as tall as I am, so some of you may not have. So this is the 2005 Thurgood Marshall Lecture on Law and Human Rights, and I'm delighted to really offer this special welcome to our distinguished speaker, Christoper Edley Jr. I'll have a few more words to say about Chris later, but first, a few words about some other special people, not with us tonight, but can't have this occasion without recognizing them. First, Johnny Cochran, a good friend to UCLA, somebody we lost recently, a UCLA alumnus, and a former Thurgood Marshall honoree, a tireless advocate of civil rights, human rights, justice under the law. We take great pride in the fact that he began his extraordinary 40-year career here at UCLA. And when Johnny was the featured speaker at this very event 2 years ago, he said he practiced law, and I quote, to comfort the afflicted and to afflict the comfortable. And he did both. He certainly did both. Many of you may not know because he did it quietly. Johnny Cochran was a generous supporter of UCLA. He established a scholarship in his father's name, Johnny Cochran Sr. at UCLA for African American young men. So far, 37 UCLA students have been Cochran scholars. He supported other things in this university as well, but always quietly and anonymously. He leaves an enormous legacy at UCLA and far beyond. We're diminished by his loss, but inspired by his life. The other person about whom we cannot have an evening like this without saying a few words, I have this opportunity every year to pay tribute to Mr. Justice Thurgood Marshall, the grandson of a slave, the first African-American justice of the United States Supreme Court. Hard to imagine that it took that many years, but it did. Committed to reshaping American society and to supporting what he called the voiceless American. Before his appointment to the High Court, an extraordinarily successful attorney, known primarily as a civil rights lawyer, but he went beyond that as well. Of course, in 1954, the landmark Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, declaring racial segregation in American schools to be unconstitutional. His legacy continues to inspire people in the United States, but now even more importantly, around the world, for his dedication to and protection of human rights everywhere. Now, the Bunche Center is an important, integral part of UCLA. Tonight's event is just one of the many significant contributions it makes to the life of UCLA and to our broader community. founded 36 years ago as the Center for African American Studies, only 2 years ago, renamed in honor of Ralph Bunche, Nobel Peace Prize winner. Its mission, as you've heard, to develop strong interdisciplinary academic and research programs in African American studies, and it really functions in all aspects of the university's mission: education, research, and service. Undergraduate and graduate degrees in African American studies, scholarship programs, the library, all kinds of special projects. It's reflective of UCLA's and my own personal strong commitment to ethnic and cultural diversity at this university. It's one of the things that has made UCLA great. We've suffered some in recent years. We're all aware of that, and we are determined to get back on the right track. So I want to applaud the center. I want to applaud its leaders, past and present, Darnell Hunt, for outstanding and influential work. And I'm grateful to all of you who support the center. Now, let me say a few words about Christoper Edley Jr. Yes, our Thurgood Marshall Lecturer this evening, the Dean of the Boalt Hall School of Law. Now, I've had the privilege of knowing Chris for almost 30 years. That's a substantial portion of my life and an even more substantial portion of his. Among our common interests was and is public policy. Thinking about it, talking about it, teaching about it, writing about it, influencing it, and making it. We did this mostly at Harvard and in Washington, and indeed we probably saw each other most often on the Boston-Washington Air Shuttle or in the vast waiting rooms at Logan and National airports. Chris Edley is a first-class thinker, a first-class doer, and a first-class person. I'm pleased to see that he, not quite as rapidly as I, saw the wisdom of coming to California, and in particular in coming to the University of California, even if he did miss the prime location by a few hundred miles. I hope that our renewed proximity will enable us to spend more time together, because I value and cherish those memories more than I can say. So I look forward to hearing from Chris after dinner. For now, I thank all of you for being here tonight and for supporting the work of this most important center. Thank you.
This is the place on the program where I get to say, enjoy your meal, but I've heard some clanking of the forks and spoons, and I think you started without me, so go ahead, enjoy your meal. Now, in the interest of time, we know you can eat quietly while the program resumes, so we're going to try and do that. It is what they call a school night, so let's respect that and keep moving with our program. We want to thank the musicians once again with the John James Quartet. They started that set with Killer Joe, one of my favorites, so thank you, gentlemen. Thank you for respecting the MC. All right. And now that you've all returned to your seats, I want to thank you for respecting the MC and enabling me to keep the program moving. It's my pleasure to introduce now a gentleman from across the street, as we say in the TV news business, but that doesn't mean we don't have a great deal in common. We're talking about the general manager from KTLA, Channel 5, the home of News at 10, and the home of a dear friend and a late colleague, Mr. Larry McCormick. If you've come to these dinners before, you've heard Larry in this role. It's my honor now to bring forward Vinnie Malcolm to speak on Larry McCormick and his legacy.
Thank you, Beverly. On behalf of KTLA and the rest of the family, I want to say thank you for having us here to pay special tribute to Larry. I want to thank the UCLA and the Bunche Center. I personally am very grateful for people like Larry, because Larry paved the way for someone like myself to be able to be the general manager of KTLA. I'm also very thankful that I had an opportunity to had a little bit of an influence in having Larry get his star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. And I'm also very pleased to announce that tonight we're going to be starting an effort to build a scholarship on behalf of Larry at the UCLA Bunche Center. And with that, now, we also have a special video tribute that we'd like to show, but at this point I'd like to introduce Jeff Wall, our news director, who actually worked with Larry for about 33 years. So Jeff.
Thank you, Vinny. It's a pleasure to be here tonight, and I just want to say to Anita McCormick that we lost a member of our family at KTLA, and KTLA is really a family-type television station. There is an emptiness that I cannot describe in our newsroom that has been there since not only when Larry passed on, but also before that when Larry was ill, and that void is still not filled today, and we miss him greatly. I will just tell you that. He was just a fabric of our environment at Channel 5, and it's just very hard to walk into that newsroom and know that Larry isn't there anymore. With that, I'd like to take a look at our DVD of Larry McCormick.
And a special tribute to Larry McCormick, KTLA news anchor.
Good evening. I'm Leila Feinstein, in tonight for Lynette Romero.
I'm Ted Garcia, in for Hal Fishman.
We at KTLA are saddened to report tonight that Larry McCormick, who has been with the station for 33 years, has died after a long illness. He was 71 years old. Larry began his distinguished career at KTLA in 1971 and was one of the first African-American television news anchors in Los Angeles, with a strong presence in the community. He died at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in Los Angeles. Here's how we remember our colleague and dear friend, Larry McCormick.
The deadline for applicants to declare their candidacy for governor is just a week away. With over 200 potential people filing to run, there are new front-runners.
Larry McCormick was an accomplished news broadcaster, a professional in every sense of the word. But more than that, he was a friend and a true gentleman. There wasn't anything Larry couldn't do in the media, and everything he did well, exceptionally well.
Good evening, I'm Larry McCormick.
And I'm Marta Waller.
For the past 35 years, Larry has been active in Los Angeles news broadcasting. He hosted musical programs, radio talk shows, and appeared in television and motion pictures. At KTLA, he started as a weathercaster and continued on as a sportscaster and anchor of the weekend edition of News at 10. Larry also reported on consumer and health issues on News at 10.
In tonight's report, air pollution from the World Trade Center attacks may have an effect on the next generation of New Yorkers.
In addition, Larry served as host of the highly acclaimed and Emmy-winning Making It, Minority Success Stories, and Pacesetters programs here on KTLA. In 1994, Larry won the prestigious Governor's Award, the highest honor presented annually by the Los Angeles Area Academy of Television Arts and Sciences, an Emmy Award that recognized his unique contribution to local television.
It's been far more than I ever expected when I first started those first few steps into television. A lot more than I expected for a lot longer.
In May of 2001, KTLA dedicated a soundstage to Larry to honor his 30 years at the station. The ceremony paid tribute to his professionalism and integrity, and for making an indelible mark on the station and everyone who met and worked with him.
He has integrity. I've never seen, in the 30 years that Larry and I have worked together, I've never seen a compromise in his quest, in his goals, in his desire for excellence in news broadcasting.
2 years ago, Larry received his very own star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame.
Today, the Hollywood Historic Trust and the Hollywood Chamber of Commerce salute Larry McCormick with his star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame.
Just once in a lifetime, a man has a moment. One wonderful moment when fate takes his hand. And this is my moment.
During his long and distinguished career, Larry covered major news events for KTLA, including an historic visit to Los Angeles by Pope John Paul II in 1987.
Good morning, Hal, and good morning, Father Manning, and it is a good morning. It's a beautiful day. There had been a forecast for some overcast this morning, but the sun shone very, very brightly as about 200 members of the media are gathered here at Los Angeles International Airport awaiting the arrival of Shepherd I and Pope John Paul II. And John Paul II greets the Archdiocese of Los Angeles, and even from the press, there is this rippling of applause.
A theater arts major at Kansas City University before switching to broadcasting, Larry never lost his love for the performing arts. He portrayed television newscasters in more than 80 TV shows and films, and often appeared with some of Hollywood's top stars. It was not just on television that Larry excelled. He devoted his life to his community, tirelessly offering his time and talents for various causes.
As one anonymous writer penned the following words, "We make a living by what we get. We make a life by what we give." Larry has given so much to so many. Larry, you have lived a big, big, fantastic life.
Larry was much more than a media star. He was always active in the Los Angeles community, where he was considered a leader of great significance. Larry organized or emceed more than 2,100 programs in the greater Los Angeles community over the past 30 years. He's been the recipient of 131 awards, citations, and honors from the government, civic, and community organizations, including an award from UCLA for his participation in its oral history program. Larry was the perennial host on the UNICEF and MDA telethons and served as the quiz master for the past 12 academic decathlon super quizzes. In his 45 years in broadcasting, including 34 in television news, Larry did it all and did it well. He brought integrity, professionalism, class, and style to everything he did.
But your magnanimity is deeply appreciated. May not be reciprocated, but it is appreciated. I do worry about the future of UCLA, not because of the faculty I'm trying to steal, but because of the truth-telling deficit your chancellor exhibits. I mean, those things he said about me, pure fantasy, pure fantasy. But Al, the check is in the mail, so thank you very much for everything you said. So let me try to, in a compressed form, talk to you about what I wanted to say. The first chapter is about the challenge that we face. The second is I want to drill down a little more deeply, specifically with respect to K through 12 education. And the third concerns our role, whereby our role, I mean those of us who are in or who support great universities in America. So, chapter 1, the challenge. Let's just do this by anecdote. There was a moment, I worked in the first couple of years in the Clinton White House, and then returned to Cambridge to try to address the footnote deficit that afflicts Western civilization. Somebody has to do it. And, but I was summoned back in February of '97 to a meeting in the West Wing when a group of the senior White House staff were having a meeting, and the then Deputy Chief of Staff introduced the meeting by saying that during the 1996 election campaign, Bill Clinton had gone around the country talking about wanting to build a bridge to the 21st century, and he kept repeating that verbal formula. And towards the end of the campaign, he added this riff about wanting to help create one America that would walk together across this bridge to the 21st century. And he kept talking about this one America, and he repeated it over and over and over. It was pretty sickening. But he really liked it, and he repeated it again in his inaugural address, and then in the State of the Union address, and then around mid-February, he turned to his top staff and he said, "So this one America thing, what is that?" I mean, it's a great speech line, I really love it, but should we be doing something, do you think, maybe, to... So there was this meeting, and the challenge for the group was to try to address this question of what does it mean to be one America, and as a leader, not just president, but as a leader in whatever community or institution you're in, what should one do to try to create one America? Now, the group there in the meeting in the West Wing, we argued for several weeks about what Clinton might do. And that finally began the beginning of Clinton's so-called race initiative. And he appointed this advisory board chaired by the eminent historian John Hope Franklin to lead this race initiative. In meeting with that group in early June of that year, 6 or 7 of them sitting in the Oval Office with the president and the vice president, plus me there as designated schmoozer. And Clinton turned to the wingback chair next to him that Al Gore was sitting in and said, "I've sat in this office with leaders from countries around the world who preside over societies in which tens of thousands of people are murdered every month because of racial, tribal, religious differences. And those leaders look to America, look at our diversity, and they're amazed at our ability to hold it together." Now, you know and I know, said Clinton to this group, that of course the reality in America is far more complicated than that. But the truth is, we're doing a bad job of dealing with our racial and ethnic differences. And as our population becomes more diverse, the danger created by our inability to deal with difference is mounting. And then he launched into what I call his apocalyptic Bosnia scenario, where he talked about Bosnia and Rwanda and the Middle East and Northern Ireland, and he said it would be hubris for us to think that somehow America can escape the pattern we've seen in so many countries throughout human history around the world. The single most important challenge facing us as we move to the 21st century, Clinton said, is the problem of dealing with racial and ethnic difference. Because the social and economic divides between us, the divisions in understanding and mistrust, threaten to ruin America as we know it. Maybe not next summer, maybe not the summer after that, but certainly within a generation, unless we do a better job of this. And he concluded by saying, I firmly believe as president, trying to exercise stewardship over the country as the first president in the 21st century, that if we can handle this problem, all the other challenges facing America, well, we can take care of those. And then he turned to his advisors and said, now what? Because the question is, given America's history with race, what can a leader do that might make a meaningful difference? Now, I frequently say in this regard that, that race is not rocket science. And I actually happened upon this. The Chancellor will recall our days of trying to advise Michael Dukakis as a presidential candidate. And I recall one day walking into Dukakis early in 1987 and saying, Governor, you're about to go out to Iowa and you're going to participate in a debate on national security, and you have to find a position on nuclear missile modernization. And he said, Edley, what are you talking about? I said, well, you see, we have these Minuteman III missiles in the silos, and they're rusting. So you have to replace them with something. Is it going to be the Midget Man missile? Is it going to be the MX missile? Or you're going to ignore the ICBMs and just rely on the Trident submarine? You have to have a position. Or maybe you want unilateral nuclear disarmament. And he said, oh, this is complicated. We better get some experts in here for a briefing. And I said, don't worry, Carnesale and company are coming this afternoon. It's going to be fun. A couple of weeks later, I went into him and I said, Governor, you're going out to Dubuque. You're going to do a debate with the NAACP on civil rights and affirmative action and school desegregation. He said, don't worry, I got it under control. I said, oh, yeah? And I started to ask him a couple of questions. He flunked the test. But he thought because he experiences race, he was an expert. But I will tell you, race is not rocket science. Rocket science is easy. Put a man on the moon, 10 years, done, right? Race is harder than rocket science, right? It's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, right? It's 50 years after Brown v. Board, and our schools and communities are still, for the most part, segregated. Race is harder than rocket science. Whatever kind of leader you are, even if you're Bill Clinton, America's first black president, it's harder than rocket science. So I just want to set up the question for you. If you wish to lead on this issue, how do you do it? How do you do it? Well, by the time we got to the race initiative, I had already worked for Clinton directing the White House review of affirmative action and had written or was in the process of writing a book on the subject. And the conclusion that I reached, the central conclusion that I reached, was that progress on affirmative action and perhaps on many other race issues is less about policy science than it is about values. So when it came to designing the race initiative, I found myself in the peculiar position in the West Wing of saying, forget about housing policy. Forget about poverty. The question is, because that's the easy part. The easy part is to suggest ways to improve housing for the poor, or to suggest ways to improve reading for fourth graders. The hard part is building a moral and political consensus to put into practice those policy ideas we have some confidence in. And we can't build that moral and political consensus unless we know how to build bridges that will connect people across lines of class and color. So ironically, in other words, I think the binding constraint in many circumstances on our ability to make progress is not that we lack for ideas in the policy realm, but that we lack for strategies in the realm of community building, of values, of knitting people together. And in that realm, I genuinely believe we're impoverished. We haven't devoted enough intellectual energy to asking the question of how you persuade people whose values are different. And I'll come back to that. I'll come back to that in a moment. So let me move to chapter 2. I want to talk a little bit about what, for my money, is perhaps the single most important challenge facing the civil rights struggle, the struggle for racial and ethnic justice, for human rights in America, and that concerns the quality of K-12 education. And the way I want to do this is I have 4 basic headlines, and for each headline I'm going to describe a danger that I see, and then some kind of possibility for a way forward for those of us who care about racial and ethnic justice. The headlines are Appomattox Redux, Plessy versus Ferguson, after all, Bull Connor is dead, and Science versus Hope. So in order, Appomattox Redux. Well, here's the danger. The danger is that in domestic matters, states' rights, notwithstanding the Civil War, always threatens to trump collective national aspirations. And racial justice has been a flashpoint. Its arc has bent towards national leadership. But in education, localism reigns supreme, or at least it tries to. We have 15,000 plus school boards, for the most part composed of civic-minded amateurs who find themselves struggling with one of the most complex social and economic problems facing the nation. And yet, we pursue localism. We have a national economy, but we depend largely on local financing of schools. And given our segregation by race and class, that's a prescription for inequality. A prescription, I would argue, we can no longer afford to take. That's the question. Given the imperatives of national prosperity, tranquility, avoiding the apocalyptic Bosnia scenario, given the imperatives of justice, how can we refashion the anachronism in education that strikes the right balance between local participation on the one hand and national aspirations for opportunity on the other? Well, that's the danger. What's the possibility? The possibility is in threats and bribes, the same way I deal with my 3-year-old, right? But in terms of threats and bribes, the constraint is that the national government, using the spending power, Congress's spending power under Article 1 of the Constitution, is constrained by the budget. There isn't enough money to spend on really big bribes, right? And the politics of really big threats seems to be, just can't be stomached by either political party. The front page of the paper today talks about lawsuits brought by a number of states and school districts against the federal government, arguing that the No Child Left Behind statute consists of a series of unfunded mandates and as such should be struck down. An attack on the strategy of threats and bribes. And the regulatory incentives, the possibility, however, it seems to me, is nevertheless we could push the argument for threats and bribes and use regulatory incentives, whether based on market forces or uber expertise or mysticism. Regulatory incentives must target the proper actors to create accountability. You can't target the teacher if the problem is homelessness. Right? You can't target the school board if the problem is there aren't any resources or taxing authority or taxable property to finance education. The litigation that, well, I'll talk about that in a minute. I mean, this lawsuit is just an outrage. But, all right, number 2, Plessy versus Ferguson, after all. So for the non-lawyers among you, Plessy versus Ferguson is the Supreme Court case that was overturned by Brown versus Board of Education. So Plessy versus Ferguson stands for the proposition of separate but equal, that segregation is all right, provided there is equality in the provision of resources, which there never was. So what's happened 50 years after Brown? Well, the truth is that Brown, all deliberate speed, the Supreme Court did basically nothing for 10 years. And then for a few years, the Supreme Court, supported by the Congress, supported by the executive branch, moved actively to try to desegregate schools, at least in the South. But after 3 or 4 years, the Nixon administration changed directions, and a couple years after that, Congress changed directions. And 15 years after that, the Supreme Court changed directions. And starting in the mid-1980s, segregation, which had been declining for African American students, started climbing again. So that today in America, schools are as segregated as they were in 1972. Latino students never experienced a school desegregation movement. And Latino students in California today are more segregated than black students in Alabama and Mississippi. And it's not just that they're racially and ethnically isolated, it's that they're concentrated in schools where the poverty is overwhelming. If you ask the question of schools that are 90% or more minority compared with schools that are 90% or more white, how many of those schools have concentrated levels of poverty? Above 75% kids on free lunch program. The answer is, if it's a minority school, they're 16 times as likely to be a high poverty school. Well, it doesn't take genius to recognize that if you concentrate all the problems of poverty in a school, the possibility of giving somebody world-class opportunity in a globalized economy, well, miracles can happen, but it's not what we would call a strategy for justice. So what we have 50 years after Brown is perhaps, in some respects, Plessy versus Ferguson after all. And the question is whether 50 years from now, will we have finally erased the color lines? Well, what about the possibilities? Well, first of all, I have to say that my own view is that equity Band-Aids, be they charter schools or categorical grant programs, won't suffice in the face of massive social forces and entrenched institutions. Now, the better strategy, I think, is to design interventions that have some hope of transforming state and local politics around opportunity. That is to say, the attractive thing to me about something like the No Child Left Behind statute is that by saying districts and schools must measure student achievement and disaggregate that by race, ethnicity, class, language, and there will be sanctions if over time you don't narrow those achievement disparities, That's an intervention strategy that already is having the effect of changing the politics of education in states and communities around the country, with the hope that over time, that changed politics will redirect billions upon billions upon billions in resources, far more than the federal government could accomplish by writing a check in a categorical program. That strategy, it seems to me, of seeking transformation in politics is likely to be more successful than equity band-aids. Bull Connor's dead. The danger here, of course, is that Americans believe that racism is dead. They deny the evidence of continuing levels of discrimination. The social science evidence is quite clear. And methodological advances in audit studies, tester studies, and the like just underscore the point. Recent developments in cognitive science on the phenomenon of implicit bias demonstrate that everybody in this room, almost, everybody in this room, harbors at a subconscious level preconceptions colored by race, by gender, by age, that affect our behavior. We may not be aware of it. As teachers, when we call on somebody and ask them a question and puzzle over whether there was a nugget of insight in what the student said, that quick judgment is influenced at a subconscious level by the way we've been socialized to think about race. And that's true whether you're white or not. It's powerful stuff. That's why it's harder than rocket science. But in thinking that Bull Connor's dead, America wants to move beyond that discussion. When Martin Luther King Jr. was killed on April 4th of 1968, a very serious problem arose in the civil rights movement. And that problem was that lawyers and policy wonks took over, folks like me. Right? The secularization of the civil rights movement meant that we stopped quoting Amos and Matthew. We stopped quoting Maimonides and the Quran, and we started talking about equal protection doctrine. We started talking about the earned income tax credit. Now, I had a difficult experience when I was a child, working at the White House in the Carter administration. One of the things I was responsible for was welfare reform. And I spent a chunk of time running a massive interagency process to design Carter's welfare reform proposal. This is back in a day when welfare reform meant spending more money on poor people. Right? And I remember going with my, right, doesn't mean that anymore. And I recall going up to the Hill to lobby a moderate Georgia Democrat with my boss, Stu Eisenstadt. And I laid out in some detail this $11 billion a year proposal for welfare reform, and it was actually quite fabulous, I thought. But he said, that's very nice, gentlemen, but I have to tell you, I'm not hearing from my constituents on this issue, right, which tells you grassroots are important. And he said, moreover, my constituents think welfare reform means spending less money, not more money. How do you expect me to tell them that? And since I was 12 years old, I didn't really have a response. But years later, what occurred to me was the following problem, is that liberals in that debate, we were talking about the earned income tax credit and two-earner families and the Medicaid notch and the benefit reduction rate and the food stamp asset limit. And the conservatives were talking about the work ethic, the deserving and undeserving poor, out-of-wedlock births. They were talking about values while we were doing policy plumbing. And guess what? the American people were not interested in the plumbing. So years later, we have a Democrat running for president saying, let's end welfare as we know it, and progressives wake up one morning and the welfare entitlement is gone because they've been doing policy plumbing while the other side's been doing values. In the racial and ethnic justice movement, we are in danger because we have ceded the values terrain to the other side. One possibility here, in addition to trying to reclaim the values terrain, one possibility is to recognize that moving forward, we must not only renovate the anti-discrimination paradigm in civil rights, but we must augment that, we must supplement that with some new strategies that don't necessarily involve moral blameworthiness, that don't necessarily involve identifying discrimination, but instead, as we do in environmental regulation, look at outcomes and ask, what do we need to do to construct greater opportunity for those who lack it? Here again, I would point to the No Child Left Behind statute, which has lots of problems. But listen to this. What it does, in part, is say, we'll measure racial disparities in achievement. We will require that school districts and schools make adequate yearly progress, AYP, to eliminate those disparities and make all students proficient by the year 2012. And if you don't make adequate yearly progress, there will be sanctions. There will be a penalty. There's no predicate of discrimination. There's no obligation that somebody go into court and prove that, look at that fellow over there. Look at that racial animus dripping from his lips. No. Instead, it's focused on the simple proposition that all of our children deserve a shot at success. So that's kind of a no-fault regulatory approach to justice that I think is a helpful complement to the anti-discrimination paradigm. It's a way of getting forward momentum without trying to persuade somebody that Bull Connor has been resurrected. Fourth, science versus hope. Well, here's the difficulty. In education particularly, the state of the social science evidence is dismal. There's not enough research. It's exceedingly rare to find a study on program effectiveness in education that demonstrates an effect bigger than 1 or 2/10 of a standard deviation. Society is so complicated, the data is so poor, the inability to do randomized controlled trials, all of these things confound the ability of scientists to do what they feel confident in characterizing as scientific proof that X is true and that Y is false. They want 98% confidence about their assertions. But look, I mean, I'm walking down the hall, I'm on my way to the floor of the House of Representatives, I'm going to cast a vote. Tell me what I should do. Oh, no, I'm sorry, Congressman, I can't tell you because the studies, I mean, on the one hand, on the other, and that's not really statistically, it's only 1/10 of a standard deviation. No, I'm going to vote. Tell me what to do. Well, I really can't, I mean, the science, I just can't, I'm a scientist, I just can't, I don't know what the truth is. All right, I'll flip a coin. Or I'll seize the latest fashion in snake oil. Right? I'll make the decision based on ideology rather than evidence. So we have this divide between what constitutes evidence, between the world of science on the one hand and the world of it's good enough for government work on the other. Part of the difficulty, therefore, is to get people who are expert to walk across the bridge between these two worlds, the world of ideas and research and the world of action. So here's the possibility. Fortunately, we're in this situation in which things are so bad, it's not that hard to think of a way to improve it. And by things are so bad, I simply mean that the nation's investment in education research, in R&D, is less than 1%. Now, I have to tell you, if you had stock in a company or in an industry that was spending less than 1% on R&D, you would sell the stock. You would just get out of that, right? You wouldn't buy stock in a pharmaceutical company that was only spending 1% on R&D. But here is education, arguably the most vital industry in the nation, and we starve it for research so that we can get some idea of what to do. And by the way, the problem with that is compounded by the fact that you got amateurs running the school systems, right? These school boards who are just civic-minded folks, right? So they're out there trying to reinvent the wheel. So this is a bad situation. What I'm trying to say, bizarrely enough, is that research on education, what we spend on education research, is a civil rights issue. It is a civil rights issue. And if we don't approach it that way, then we're condemning the future of education policy to ideology, to mysticism, to fashion. Our children can't afford that. Our children can't afford that. Which finally brings me to chapter 3. So here we are. We're in a university setting, or we support universities. My firm belief, when I came to, I never had any interest in being law school dean. I've told this, it is a ridiculous job. The best job, ask the law faculty here. The best job is to be a tenured professor. And, being the dean is like being a fire hydrant in a, adjacent to a kennel. And so the first three times the search committee called me to see if I'd be interested, I said no. I'm too smart for that. But then I had some open heart surgery, and they called me at a moment of weakness, and I was on drugs or something. So I agreed to come out and talk to the search committee. First question they asked me is, so why do you think you might be interested in being dean? And I said, I don't think I am. And then the second question they asked me is, what do you think is distinctive about the mission of a great public law school? And I said, great question. Haven't thought about that. Never been at one. Never wanted to be at one. Does the faculty think there's something special about the mission? And they said, yes, absolutely, but we're not sure what it is. And I said, well, I sort of played with, I must have mumbled something relatively coherent, because, here I am. But here's the way I think, here's the way I put it together now. A way to think about it is certainly, let's just stipulate the part about excellence in teaching and training. Excellence, which, of course, I don't need to tell you folks, entails inclusivity. And let's just stipulate the part about excellence in research and the production of knowledge, although I could say a lot about distinctive and important ways in which we can pursue that. But with respect to those two things, excellence in the teaching and excellence in the research, I think, the dean at Harvard could give that speech too. The real distinctiveness, it seems to me, comes in the third part, which is, the way I put it is, it's about harnessing our excellence in training leaders and our excellence in the production of knowledge. Harnessing that excellence to be deeply engaged in tackling the toughest, most important problems that are facing the society in both the private sector and the public sector. Of doing that, of being engaged with an intentionality that private universities usually just don't muster. I mean, sure, they make contributions, but it's kind of happenstance, it's kind of random. So what I'm suggesting is that as public institutions, we have both an opportunity and a duty to harness our excellence to make a difference. Now, we can't tackle every problem, but we ought to have a portfolio of issues on which we're providing luminous leadership. Now, for my money, if you're going to start listing the issues, racial and ethnic justice is right up there. So the challenge to us is to find ways in which our excellence as research and teaching institutions can engage these difficult, harder than rocket science issues involving racial and ethnic justice. Or to put it another way, the proposition is that the forward momentum of the struggle for civil and human rights depends critically upon the extent to which we can help provide the intellectual capital to fuel that movement in a way that complements the contributions being made by others. We don't have to organize communities because there are other people who'll be better at that than we can be. But we can do the research, and if we pick the topics the right way, and if we invest in the challenge of translating and disseminating that research so that it's useful, we can make a difference. Now, to bring this full circle, the natural temptation, in a way, is to do research on problems like how to design a better earned income tax credit, or what's the niftiest argument I can make about equal protection doctrine. And that's all well and good. But I'd go back to what I said in the West Wing of the White House in 1997. And that is that there are other intractable issues that are the binding constraints on forward progress. Issues that often have a softer character to them. Issues where the methodology about how to examine them may be far less clear. But we have to resist two temptations as academics. One temptation is to work on the things that matter most to us personally, even though it may not be of most need to our community. And the second temptation is of being like the carpenter who only has a hammer and therefore every problem looks like a nail, right? We have to recognize that the toughest problems often require multiple disciplines to engage effectively, which means that as we struggle to produce the intellectual capital that will make a difference, we have to be relentlessly collaborative across disciplinary lines, across professional lines. Shortly after I started teaching at Harvard in 1981, I was invited to a dinner for the newly installed Archbishop and Cardinal in Boston, Bernard Cardinal Law. I don't know why I was invited to the dinner. I'm not Catholic, not even religious. Must have been affirmative action. But I went to this small gathering, and Boston was going through one of its periodic fits of racially motivated violence, and a couple of people had been killed. And Cardinal Law had a background working in the South on racial justice issues, a quite distinguished and inspiring background. And so I asked him, I said, Your Eminence, I think that was the right thing to call him, I don't know. I said, Your Eminence, what about this violence in our community? I mean, people are killing each other, it's just terrible. Do you think there is any possibility of reconciliation across color lines here in Boston? And he said, yes, I do. And I said, why? I was learning how to do the Socratic thing, right? I said, why? And he said, well, because I believe in the basic goodness of human nature. And I said, why? And he said, well, because I believe in the possibility of redemption. And before I could say why, he said, because Christ has risen. I decided to leave it at that. But in thinking about it afterwards, I mean, what occurred to me was that here is a man who has this incredible faith in the possibility of transforming communities. Where did he get it from? Where did he get it from? Now, one possibility, of course, is that he got it because he read a brief on equal protection doctrine, right? It's a possibility, I suppose, you know. More likely, something experiential. I mean, putting aside the Holy Spirit explanation, right? Something experiential. So here we are, lawyers and policy wonks, and we frequently try to persuade people about the possibility and the imperative of redemption by talking about the policy plumbing, as opposed to thinking about experiences, designing experiences that have a transformative possibility in people's sense of connection across lines of class and color. What I mean to suggest is that a question of that sort, how do you persuade people whose views are different? What experiences may have a transformative impact? I mean, is it labor union organizing? Is it working together in a political campaign? Is it working in some charitable enterprise? Is it sitting next to each other in 4th grade? What are the experiences that hold the transformative possibility that's so fundamental to connecting people? It's a researchable question. It's a researchable question. It's a hard question. If we don't try to answer it, who will? Let me close then with one last anecdote for which I apologize. A few years ago, I gave a talk on affirmative action to a group of minority and women officers of the Central Intelligence Agency. It was not a huge group. We did it at a covert military facility in Virginia. I could tell you where it is, but I have to kill you all. And Al knows where it is. And after 45 minutes of Socratic inquisition of this group of about 200 people, asking them questions about affirmative action and putting them in different hypothetical situations and just humiliating them, I stopped. I said, look, stop. You folks are terrible at this. You're absolutely terrible at this. Why are you so bad? Well, one reason I think you're so bad is that if you're like me, if somebody wants to talk about some morally vexing issue, abortion, death penalty, affirmative action, typically, end of a hard day, I try to change the subject, right? I mean, I'll even talk about sports to try to change the subject. If I do talk about it, if you do talk about it, more likely than not, it's with people who are relatively like-minded, right? You engage in what I call choir practice. right? We're singing together, we're practicing our harmonies. It feels so good. It is, I mean, it's just so nourishing. Now, there's a role for that. That is important because, you know, these battles are tough. You need that nourishment. That makes sense. But, if we're going to make progress, if we're going to build consensus, moral and political consensus, not just the policy ideas, but the moral and political consensus to put them into action, it requires not just choir practice, but missionary practice. It requires practice at engaging people whose experiences and whose values are different from your own. And it's hard to do. Remember, it's harder than rocket science. It's hard to do. It's one of the things we ought to be doing in a great university. Teaching people how to be missionaries, how to reach across divisions of experience, of values. I'm not quite sure about how it all should happen. But I do have one thought, one idea. And that is that when you enter into that engagement, you must search for the kernel of truth in what the other side is saying. Like being a good lawyer, preparing for an oral argument, trying to find the weakest part of your case and the strongest part of your opponent's case. You must search for the kernel of truth in what the other side is saying, because then you will be in a position to insist that they do the same toward you. And that is the beginning of building a bridge. Thank you so much for letting me speak here tonight. Fire marshal requests that you not all rush for the doors immediately.
Good evening. My name is Priscilla Ochen.
I'm Peter Carr, and we are the incoming 2005-2006 co-chairs for the Black Law Student Association. On behalf of the Bunche Center, UCLA School of Law, Black Law Student Association, and the National Black Law Journal, we would like to thank you for your words and your work. We have a small token of appreciation.
We have an award that reads the Ralph J. Bunche Center for African American Studies at UCLA proudly presents this award to Christoper Edley Jr. for his leadership and commitment to the struggle for civil rights and for delivering the keynote address for the 16th Annual Thurgood Marshall Lecture on Law and Human Rights, April 21st, 2005.
Thank you.
Did you all just see the keynote speaker jump off the stage? I've never seen that before. We have stairs over. No, it's okay. Wow. You may think of yourself as the fire hydrant, sir, but to us, you are the drum major. God bless you. We are confident tonight's program left you with nourishment, to coin a phrase, for your mind, body, and soul. And thanks to the keynote speaker, again, Christoper Edley. Another round of applause, if you please. Also, the Bunche Center director, Darnell Hunt. The John James Quartet. the banquet supervisor, Augustine Carpio, and his staff. We want to mention the folks who served the food and the hands that prepared it. It is my professional and personal pleasure to thank you all for your continued and current support of the Ralph J. Bunche Center. Good luck, Godspeed, and thank you for your kind attention. Good night, everybody.